Suatu hari nanti, anda pasti ada idea.
Saya ada idea.
Idea yang bagus. Barangkali idea yang hebat. Atau mungkin idea yang bakal mencetuskan satu revolusi.
Yang merubah segalanya.
Kemudian, anda tersedar.
Jap.
Tapi, macam mana nak mulakan?
Di sinilah peranan kami. Kamilah PUNB dan kami sentiasa bersama untuk membantu perniagaan anda berkembang maju.
Serius lah.
Serius.
Hebat. Tapi, bagaimana?
Pasukan kami bersedia membantu anda dari segi konsep, pengurusan keuangan dan akan memberikan nasihat ke arah kaedah pemasaran yang terbaik.
Bagusnya.
Ya, memang bagus. Nampak tak? Bukan setakat menyediakan pembiayaan. Kami juga memberi anda kepakaran untuk mengembangkan perniagaan anda.
Kepakaran yang bagaimana?
Mencari lokasi pejabat atau lot kedai anda, kursus dan latihan keusahawanan, mendapatkan pembekal, pengubahsuaian, inovasi produk, pemasaran, penjualan, pengedaran, peraukanan dan seterusnya, penguasaan global.
Tunggu dulu.
Apa syaratnya?
Syarat? Tiada syarat. Oops, sebentar. Sebenarnya ada.
Dah agak dah.
Anda mestilah memiliki daya usaha. Kami sukakan semangat dan dedikasi yang tinggi. Jika anda ada itu, kami ingin bekerja bersama anda.
Daya usaha? Saya boleh lakukan. Saya pun.
Teruskan.
Tapi, ada lagi.
Ada lagi?
Kami akan menjalinkan anda dengan jaringan usahawan komuniti kami untuk peluang usaha sama, saling berhubung dan belajar di antara satu sama lain.
Bagusnya.
Inilah PUNB, membantu usahawan membentuk perniagaan mereka. Jadi, adakah anda mahu berkembang maju bersama PUNB?
associations of DFIs in Asia Pacific. The aim of this webinar is to equip DFIs in the emerging markets to recognize the challenges and find opportunities associated with
Recording in progress.
With case study presentations. The focus is also going to be on how DFIs can direct capital flows towards sustainable investments by demonstrating the opportunities and potential returns. We have received quite a good response to this webinar. About 400 participants have registered across India, Malaysia, Philippines, Japan, and other countries. So to begin with, a quick introduction of the organizers. ADFIAP is the focal point of 87 development banks and other financial institutions engaged in sustainable development financing in about 36 countries and territories in the Asia-Pacific region. OCTA-CSG is a global expert advisory firm in climate finance, ESG, climate risks, aimed at accelerating global sustainable finance and climate transition. The organization stands at the intersection of finance, investment, and sustainability. OCTA-CSG has been awarded marquee projects by international governments, multilaterals, and financial institutions in a very short period of time. ADFIM's unique combination of DFIs and entrepreneur development organizations has a membership base of 17 institutions managing assets over 200 billion Malaysian ringgits. ADFIM aims to promote synergy and collaboration towards unleashing entrepreneurship potential to serve the unserved and the underserved. A few quick announcements before we begin. We have an exciting lineup of speakers, so I would request each speaker to please observe their prescribed speaking time. For the participants, please key in your questions in the Q&A box on the screen, and the moderators will take it up. In addition to Zoom, this event is also being live streamed on ADFIM's YouTube and Facebook page. We will begin with the presentations first, followed by a panel discussion. We start with Mr. Mohammad Prasad Hanif, the Secretary General of ADFIM. Mr. Hanif has over 16 years of professional success on national and international levels, with strong concentration in project management, business development, and human capital development. As a board member and the Secretary General of ADFIM, he guides the organization on innovative products and financial inclusion. Can we have Prasad, please?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very good evening. Mr. Enrique Florencio, Secretary General of the Association of Development Financing Associations in Asia and the Pacific, Council members of the Association of Development Finance Institutions Malaysia, ADFIM, fellow eminent speakers and experts from Octas ESG, and respected guests and participants from around the world. Welcome to Malaysia, and welcome to this high-level webinar on financing net zero, a focus on DFIs in emerging markets. Let me first say how grateful I am to each and every one of you for joining us here today. This impressive turnout shows that sustainable finance is no longer a niche. It is going mainstream. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a wake-up call for prompting governments, businesses, and investors to pay greater attention to environmental, social, and governance (ESG) issues, and stimulating all stakeholders to chart a sustainable recovery. The pandemic has revealed not only our vulnerability as a society, but also the critical importance of sustainable development. In the case of development finance institution, it brings to light the importance of climate-focused financing. Climate financing sets an opportunity for global players as well as Malaysian players to refocus on the benefits of sustainability and responsible investment. While firms move through the recovery phase, they need also to look to the new reality in which delivering sustainable finance will be an imperative. I think that this webinar is timely for us to realign our financing schemes to include the return not only in financial but also on the governance, environmental, social aspects as well. Therefore, Since last year, ADFIM, along with various collaborative partners, has been a strong proponent in Sustainable Development Agenda, organizing engagement sessions and forums with domestic and international partners. ADFIM has organized numerous international forums with experts from Qatar Development Bank, DFCC Bank of Sri Lanka, China Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, IPDC Finance from Bangladesh, and many, many more. As an association, we strive to continuously engage with various stakeholders to champion the Sustainable Development Agenda. Specifically, sustainable financing. As such, we see amazing partnerships and collaborations being forged. Like today, we have Octus ESG and ADFIAP on the same stage with ADFIM. Today, we continue to bring recognized speakers from around the world. They're coming from various time zones to share their experience in this crucial subject matter, as well as sharing the trend that we hope to see for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, today's webinar is an important step in mobilizing the broad support needed to turn this strategy, these talks, into practice. The various actors here today, we have DFI executives, businesses, civil societies, regulators, supervisors, central banks, and all others. All of us have a part to play. Aligning financial portfolios with the Paris Agreement goals requires that financial institutions view their portfolios and holdings in a holistic manner, managing their full carbon footprint across sector, geographic, and asset class exposures. Secondly, financial institutions around the world have made commitments. They are going to have to prove that they are meeting them to a world that increasingly is skeptical about greenwashing. This means full public reporting. And finally, intermediary targets are for 2030, the latest. That's 8 years. That's how long financial institutions have to reach their first key milestone. So now they need to take immediate concrete action. If financial institutions are serious about net zero portfolios, they can't keep financing the expansion of infrastructure, technologies, and business models that are incompatible with their goals, and in the case of DFIs, incompatible with the country's SDG goals. This webinar will give us ideas and shared experiences for us to set out the way forward. I hope that you will leave here inspired by the ideas you have heard and equipped with arguments to convince others back in your organization and countries. I invite you all to act as ambassadors for climate financing, net zero financing. I also hope that the participants will engage with the speakers throughout today's webinar. We have provided Q&A opportunities for each session, and with that note, I would like to conclude my speech by encouraging all delegates today to participate. I wish everyone a successful, safe, and fruitful webinar. Enjoy. Thank you. A very good evening, and wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much for the address, Prasad. That was very inspiring. I must congratulate you on this significant work being undertaken at ADFIM. Moving on, I would like to now invite Mr. Enrique Florencio, the Secretary General of ADFIAP. He has over 15 years of experience in ESG and works with the ADFIAP members to promote the integration of ESG standards to increase financing for environmentally sustainable and socially responsible projects. Over to you, Enrique.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. First, I would like to thank the Association of DFIs in Malaysia, Octus ESG, and of course ADFIAP for making this event possible. What we will be aiming for by the end of this webinar is very crucial. Financing net zero, focus on DFIs in emerging markets, has been chosen as a theme because it is a fundamental threat to development in our lifetime. We know that if we don't confront climate change, there will be no hope of ending poverty or boosting shared prosperity. Furthermore, the longer we delay in tackling climate change, the higher the cost will be to do the right thing for our planet and our children. What exactly does that mean, and how does this affect us in the field of development finance? Achieving net zero means zero carbon or greenhouse gas emissions across all our portfolios, which will influence corporate behavior to take climate-related issues and projects into account in any of their future endeavors, if they are to get priority support and loans or funding from any financial institutions. In this webinar, we will discuss how, as financial institutions, can help to accelerate the decarbonization of economies as per our commitment in what was announced at the GFAN's Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero at COP26, and we need to know the role we play in catalyzing significant engagement towards achieving net zero commitments. Our main goal today is to provide information and skills needed by developing markets and to evaluate all the difficulties and possibilities that come with funding a net zero transition. We also need to talk about how we can overcome hurdles on private investments flows so we can fund a more meaningful transition. We need to showcase all the opportunities and potential rewards that DFIs may use to guide financial flows towards sustainable initiatives. To meet net zero goals, we need to guarantee that portfolios, including cutting value chain emissions and successfully negate any uncontrollable emissions, are achieved. The climate change has been particularly difficult to tackle because of what economists refer to as externalities, or problems outside the economic system that can't be solved by a single corporation or nation. Carbon emissions are by far the most significant externality in the global economy. Yet, no single organization has been held responsible for lowering them. By committing to reevaluating our objectives and realigning our portfolios, perhaps we can achieve this before it is too late. I hope you find today's discussions informative, beneficial, as well as inspirational. Thank you so much once again, and good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Enrique. That was very succinct and insightful. As in the second part of the webinar, we would also have a climate side chat on enhancing capital flows towards net zero. This session would be moderated by Namita Vikas. Namita is a senior business leader with over 30 years of diverse global experience in climate strategy and sustainability across sectors including banking, technology, and FMCG, with a particular focus on sustainable climate and green finance, climate action, ESG, and climate risk management. She was instrumental in launching the first ever Green Bond of India, getting the accreditation awarded from the Green Climate Fund, GCF. She has raised a number of green and sustainable wholesale and retail financing products and has contributed to raising over $1 billion as capital and credit lines. She founded Octus ESG in 2020, which was a global expert advisory firm on sustainable finance and ESG, which has been recently awarded the India's SME Leadership Champion Award by the UN Women 2001 Asia Pacific Women Empowerment Principles. Moving on, we now commence with our presentations for the webinar. Our next speaker is Mr. Remco Fischer, who would be presenting the role of FIs in achieving net zero. Remco is currently the climate change lead at United Nations Environment Programme's Finance Initiative. He works on developing and implementing projects that support the alignment of the finance sector with climate-compatible economic development. Remco, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanika. I hope you can hear me. A good morning to those joining from Europe. I think that's a minority, and good afternoon to those joining from the Asia Pacific region, which I assume is the majority of the audience today. Thank you very much also to the co-organizers of today's webinar for having UNEP-FI invited. It's much appreciated. Yes, I'm here representing UNEP-FI. Unipify is a network of now over 400 financial institutions, largely from the private sector. It's 95% commercial institutions. And we work with these members to help green the finance sector ultimately, so that the finance sector has the tools, users can use the tool that it has to help green the real economy, which is where the environmental impacts, both positive and negative, of course, occur. To me, as the climate change coordinator and climate change lead at Unipify, greening the economy means two more specific things. It means decarbonizing the economy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions in line with scientific pathways. And it also means making the economy resilient to the physical impacts of climate change that we already are seeing today. Today, my presentation will focus on the greenhouse gas emissions, so the carbon part. And I think the slide that you can see now, let me just check that the slides are up. Yes, they are up. The slide that you can see now tells you the whole story about the Unipify approach to climate change. It tells you, you can see on the right-hand side, that we work with banks, investors, insurers, the three constituencies. Although on investors, we do work very closely now and in full cooperation with the Principles for Responsible Investment. And then what you see on the left-hand side is the fact that we work on climate change along two prongs. The first prong is what we call the climate risk prong. So this is all about working with our members in developing methodologies and data so that they're able to identify, quantify, assess, and ultimately disclose the climate risks that they face, that their portfolios face. And this is what typically we would call the outside-in materiality. You can see here on the slide that I'm calling it the dual materiality. The outside-in materiality always is about the impacts that a changing world, that climate change is likely to have on portfolios. That's climate risk. That's the outside-in materiality of climate change, that some people would call it. The second prong, which we're here to discuss today, is climate alignment. This is all about, this responds to more the inside-out materiality of climate change. So it responds to the impacts that financial institutions have on external climate-related parameters, such as greenhouse gas emissions. And here, the focus of the work is, of course, making commitments towards climate alignment, towards net zero, which is what we want to discuss today. And then importantly, setting targets, as Mohad also mentioned earlier, setting near-term targets to decarbonize portfolios in line with the science, and then executing strategies and measures to also achieve those targets. And here, you can see this on the right-hand side of the slide. Firstly, this whole piece of work responds to the Paris Agreement, because within the Paris Agreement, there's Article 2.1c that commits all governments around the world to ensure that all finance becomes aligned with the Paris Agreement. So that's one thing. And the way we operationalize this work, we work on this with our members, is through the Net Zero Alliances, of which Unipify manages or co-manages three: the Net Zero Banking Alliance, where there are now over 100 members with over 65 trillion in assets. Then we have the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance with 71 members and over 10 trillion in assets, and also the Net Zero Insurance Alliance with over 20 members, representing more than 20% of world insurance premium. We can move to the next slide, please. So why are we doing this focus? What does it mean to align a portfolio with the Paris Agreement? And why is this the probably most important approach and concept in the sustainable finance space? It means that over time, the greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon emissions that a financial portfolio is exposed to, or in other words, the greenhouse gas emissions that are contained within a financial portfolio, reduce in line with those greenhouse gas emissions pathways economy-wide that we know are consistent with the Paris Agreement. And consistency with the Paris Agreement means consistency with a final temperature outcome of limiting the mean global temperature increase by 2100 to well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees. And so if that happens at the level of a portfolio, that emissions go down like that, what also will happen is that on the books of financial institutions, we will see a replacement. I think that's the key word here, a replacement. We will see a replacement of unsustainable, high carbon exposures, assets, technologies, business models, infrastructure, etc., with sustainable, low carbon exposures, assets, technologies, business, infrastructure. This is what you see on the right-hand side of the slide here. There's a replacement going on of the unsustainable assets and business models with green, sustainable assets and business models. Next slide, please. And this is a really important focus to have, or a really important approach to have here, because at the moment we're not seeing that replacement. What we are seeing is, of course, there's been considerable growth in the green financing space. And here the slide shows you the situation when it comes to power generation. When it comes to power generation specifically, but I think this is the case across sectors, but on power generation specifically, you can see that, yes, there's massive investment going into renewables and into sustainable energy. And that's been growing for years. You cannot see the growth here, but we know that there's been significant growth of investment. But you can also see that the investment that goes into fossil fuel assets, which here is on the bottom, the light blue bits here, they're not necessarily going down. They're going down a little bit perhaps, but they're pretty stagnating. The investment into the fossil fuel economy is pretty, when it comes to power, is pretty constant. So we're not doing this replacement yet. We're building a green economy, you can say, on top of an unsustainable economy. And that's not solving the problem, because it means that emissions still going up, as we can witness today. Now, in response to that, we can move on to the next slide. As I've said, UNEP-FI is fully embracing the alignment agenda, aligning holistically portfolios, in this case with the Paris Agreement. And in the three alliances that we have for banks, asset owners, insurance companies, the way we're helping the members of these alliances operationalize these net zero commitment is along these 5 key steps here. And let me take you through those real quick. The 5 key steps that every financial institution, I would say commercial, but also development finance institutions, I don't think the logic differs here at all. The 5 key steps they have to go through when they commit to align, when they commit to net zero, and when they start implementing their activities towards net zero is, number 1, they need to be very clear in terms of establishing and specifying what's the level of ambition here. Okay, net zero by 2050, that already is a key determinant. But what's the temperature alignment? Is it net zero by 2050 in alignment with 2 degrees? Because that's a possibility. Or is it net zero by 2050 in alignment with 1.5 degrees? Next step, 2050 is very far away. That's why intermediary near-term targets, Mohad also mentioned this at the beginning, are of the essence for the credibility and for the feasibility of this. Near-term targets need to be set ideally by 2025. We've seen some of the financial institutions do that, and they need to be set the latest by 2030. But how that works, I'll go into that in a few minutes. Then the third step, quite logically, is for financial institutions to assess where their portfolios currently are at when it comes to their carbon exposures and the contained carbon, etc. And also an assessment of where would that portfolio go from now into the future naturally. If there wasn't any additional action taking, additional measures taken, what would happen with that? And once the financial institution knows and has a sense of that, they can take corrective actions, which is the next point 4, which is for the DFIs to develop an implementation strategy, a strategy that will help them achieve those intermediary targets and then ultimately also honor their long-term commitment by 2050. And the 5th step, unsurprisingly, will be about tracking progress over time and reporting publicly on that progress. Now, let me take you in the next slide. What are some of the key aspects for step 1? And I'll just take you quickly through them. I'm happy for the slides to be circulated with the audience later on so everyone can look a little bit more in detail on those. But what are some of the key aspects here when you're setting your level of ambition as a financial institution? First, you need to say which emissions are in scope. Are you looking at your operational in-house emissions as a bank or an investor, your scope 1 emissions, or are you looking at your portfolio emissions? And of course, our focus here is at UNEP-FI and in the alliances is portfolio emissions, because those are 98 or 99% of the emissions, the total emissions that a financial typically has to deal with. Number two, if it is the portfolio emissions, which again, for us, it absolutely is, then which parts of the portfolio are in scope? Which asset classes, which transaction types, which geographic exposures, which sectoral exposures? Number three, what's the scope of the emissions for the portfolio companies? So if you're looking at the emissions of your oil and gas clients or your oil and gas portfolio companies, are you looking at their operational emissions? So scope 1, scope 2, or are you looking at their full supply chain emissions, incorporating, in the case of oil and gas, for instance, the emissions coming from the combustion of that oil and gas by the end clients? And here, I'll speak a little bit to that just in a minute. What types of greenhouse gas emissions are in scope? There's not only CO2, there's methane, there's HFCs, there's black carbon, there's a number of different things that need to be tackled. And lastly, I said it already, net zero by 2050 doesn't tell the full story about what the ambition is. It just tells you what in 2050 shall be the case. But what's the overall, over time, alignment of the portfolio with temperature outcome? This also needs to be specified. Is it with 1.5 degrees an alignment, or is it with 2 degrees, or is it with 2.5 degrees, or whatever it may be? Next slide. This gives you a rundown of the various net zero alliances. As I've said, 3 are facilitated and co-convened by us at UNEP-FI, but there are many others. On our side, it's again the banks, the commercial banks, asset owners, institutional asset owners, commercial insurance companies. There's a number of other alliances for the asset managers, for the service providers that are facilitated by other organizations, not UNEP. And all of them together are a part of the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And GFANZ in turn is a part of the Race to Zero as the finance component of it, alongside other sectoral efforts on net zero, such as by cities or by corporates of other sectors, hospitals, etc. Let's move on to the target setting, which is the most important element in this whole journey. Setting intermediary targets on your path as a financial institution to net zero by 2050. So what are some of the key aspects here that need to be on the table? Which emissions pathways exactly are you using to set your intermediary targets? What assumptions are in there? For instance, if you look at the pathways coming out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, for net zero and 1.5, there's a multitude of different pathways with different assumptions. So a financial institution needs to be clear which assumptions is it using in the choice of the scenario, and then also in the setting of the target. And there can be great divergence in terms of the targets depending on the choice of these assumptions. Other aspects to consider, are these portfolio-wide targets or sector-specific targets, or both, a combination of the two? What metrics are being used? Absolute emissions at the portfolio level, sector intensities. If you're using sector intensities, is that a sector intensity for the full portfolio, or is it a sector intensity just for a part of the portfolio, so for a sector? Is the target by 2025 or by 2030, of course? And are the targets only outcomes-based? Are you really looking at quantitative KPIs that you want to achieve over time? Or are you also including activity-based targets, such as procedural targets, such as you as a financial institution wanting to carry out certain activities as part of a strategy? We can move to the next slide. I'll be wrapping up in 2 minutes. So let me just give you a few examples of the how this is panning out in some of the alliances. So for the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, it's published its target setting protocol now in its second iteration, and this guides the setting of intermediary targets. So here the members need to set targets for all major asset classes, listed equities, corporate bonds, real estate, infrastructure. The total portfolio-wide GHG reduction by 2025 needs to be of in between 22% and 32%. And the total portfolio-wide GHG reduction by 2030 needs to be in between 49 and 65%. To give you a few examples in the next slide of some of what these targets are looking at. And there's a lot of detail here. So again, we'll circulate the slides later. So one example, for instance, is you can see it on the bottom of the slide, the UN Staff Pension Fund, who is a member of the Net Zero Asset Alliance. They've set a target to reduce the absolute emissions footprint of their equity and corporate bonds portfolios 40% by 2025. Let me give you another example, which is more at the sector level in terms of these targets. Pension Denmark, on the upper right-hand side of the slide, have committed to reducing emissions in the four most important carbon-intensive sectors that they're exposed to. For oil and gas, they want to reduce 20% by 2025. For utilities, 35% by 2025. Cement by 10% and shipping by 15%. There's examples here also for some of the other target categories, more activity-focused target categories, but I'm not going to go into that now. Let me quickly take you to the banks, and I'll be wrapping up shortly. This is then the equivalent for the banks. We have a set of guidelines that was produced. These guidelines facilitate the setting of targets on everything that banks have over time on their balance sheets, lending and investing. Investment banking activities, guidelines for that, which are more off balance sheet, will come a little bit later. It covers 9 key economic sectors, and it has the same level of ambition as the Asset Owner Alliance. So the underlying scenarios are IPCC scenarios, net zero 1.5, with the most conservative assumptions that I've mentioned earlier. A few examples here of what these targets look like. On the next slide, you can see the targets here on the upper box from Intesa Sao Paulo in Europe, with science-based emissions intensity reduction targets for key sectors, oil and gas, all scopes. So this includes also the scope 3 emissions of the oil and gas companies, so the end combustion of the oil or gas by the end client. Power generation, you can see it here. Automotive, again, scope 3, really important, and science-based intensity reduction targets for their portfolios. And on the bottom half, you'll see some examples from Citi with also strong science-based reductions, not in the easy sectors. This is not about decarbonizing pharmaceuticals. This is about decarbonizing oil and gas, power, automotive, coal mining, and other such elements. Let me perhaps just stop here with the targets, because this really is the most important element of this journey. In terms of the other steps, you'll see them in the slides, what the other steps are. I've mentioned them earlier, and perhaps we can engage on a little bit of a conversation later on during the event. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, Remco. That was very insightful, especially to get a bird's eye view of UNEP-FI's stand on net zero, especially the part on setting the intermediary targets. So thank you so much for that. To complement this presentation, we have Suranjali Tandon, Assistant Professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Suranjali is the Shivling Financial Services Fellow 2019 at King's College London, and she currently leads the work on sustainable finance at the Institute. She's a special invitee to the subgroup on finance and regulation task force for sustainable finance. She has also co-authored the report on just transition finance roadmap for India, and she writes extensively on issues related to green finance. Suranjali would be presenting on how to finance a credible transition in the context of net zero. Over to you, Suranjali.
Thank you, Sanika, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I think I'll pick up from Mr. Fisher's presentation last. What he talked about was absolutely relevant to say we have to define, the pathway. We have to define what the net zero plan really looks like. And starting from that point, there are going to be significant impact that you're going to see across the economy. So moving away from fossil fuels is not just about rejigging, how businesses work today in specific sectors, which would include oil and gas, which would include cement or in construction and transportation. It means that there are going to be technologies which are going to change business as usual. They're going to change how skills and are employed and how people are employed in these sectors. So I think as we think about net zero and the future of developing countries, it's important to understand what the externalities, not just in terms of emissions, but also in terms of human engagement is. So just transition speaks to that agenda. It says there will be employment effects, there will be livelihood effects. So for example, it's easy to imagine a model which looks at a net zero target, but that also requires that there are equipments at the moment in use which are geared to employ fossil fuels. Whether it's cars, whether this is electricity, it's all sort of geared to fossil fuels, and therefore consumers that are a large part of this economy are a focus group will also have to make a significant shift. So therefore, there needs to be at least a deep thinking on what the just transition roadmap for economies transitioning out looks like. At the moment, the thinking on just transition is very, very new, especially for countries like India. There's been some movement in respect of trying to find, at least in the mining community, what kind of effects are sort of or unfold after there is a closure and after there is a decarbonization path. So, for example, the Indian government, the Ministry of Coal, has collaborated with World Bank to define what the just transition framework might look like and what are the potential ways of financing this. So that's a broad brush sort of introduction to what just transition may be. It's also important to understand that it's not a new agenda. For many, many decades, all countries have been focusing on this. And since this is a talk which is organized by DFIs and for all listeners who may be engaged in the sector, DFIs are not new to conversation on just transition. If you look at their portfolios, the social element is a significant consideration when extending loans. So I would imagine that it's important and it's also feasible for DFIs to tie in their goals with just transition as much as a government can do with net zero plans. So moving from there, what are the challenges and opportunities at the moment? What I understand is the first important challenge that we've seen in developing markets is the access to capital. So these are not projects that typically would involve high rates of return and may in fact have a significant risk exposure. For this purpose, while we've seen large companies engaging with investors on their just transition frameworks internally, it's still very new. There is still a lack of capital that can be scaled up. The only interesting example that I can think of in India, for example, where capital is available within the thinking or framework of just transition is the impact bonds. Impact bonds are sort of tied in with outcomes that are socially driven. These could be skilling, this could be promoting the participation of women in the labor force. All of these are small ticket loans that are geared towards specific outcomes and leverage philanthropy money. So as I imagine that these are great examples, but then there is need for scaling it up. It's heartening to see that the Indian government is exploring this avenue for finance. So for example, the National Skill Development Council has issued its own impact bond on reskilling, which I would imagine is an important element within the just transition framework as employees move from old skills to new skills. And so therefore, this is one particular instrument that can be used by DFIs. So I would imagine in the next coming years, just transition bonds might perhaps be a very important instrument to leverage growth that is equalizing. Then, of course, there is always the issue of losses. As I had mentioned, that it's not always certain what the returns on these projects may be, and credit guarantee is another way to do it. There are governments that are already engaging on credit guarantee in different spaces. So, for example, small and medium enterprises in India receive credit guarantee from the government under specific schemes, and it is also possible to imagine that this might be done for sustainable projects or for projects that sort of employ more people. So for labor intensive industries. So I think one other way to do it is that not just the government, but DFIs can play a significant role in credit guarantee. Of course, the design of these instruments need to be thought through. If we scale up and think of what are the examples across the world, so people will be curious as to whether just transition has really made a headway anywhere else. What are the financing instruments that are available? So interestingly, in terms of core implementation strategies and in terms of envisioning what just transition may entail at local level, because as I remind you, all the just transition element is very hyper localized. And so therefore thinking has to percolate down at the micro level. And in order to address this and to plan for it, the UK is already sort of, the UK set up Just Transition Commission. We see that happening in Scotland already. And so therefore, that's one example of planning. But on the other hand, if you think about financing, in Europe, there has been a focus on just transition-led financing. There's a separate fund dedicated to it. So as I'd imagine, if we can specify what the net zero pathway looks like, and therefore also sort of understand the macro implications in terms of employment and replacement of consumption utilities, then imagine what the funding may be required for this just transition, and then dedicate funds, which could be, pooling, it could be a pooling vehicle, or it could be sort of a joint partnership between public and private, and there I think DFIs are absolutely critical. So in my view, there is a great scope for leveraging what the DFIs are already doing. There is already thinking in terms of safeguard policies that might sort of imbibe the do no significant harm framework. In the next couple of months, just transition will also perhaps gain traction when India defines what the list of activities are in its taxonomy, which also takes care of the just transition framework of thinking. And I just stop with saying that the major challenge in this space is perhaps the scaling up of finance, and imagining that just transition is actually not new. It's just a way of rethinking businesses in a holistic fashion to say all externalities, not just in terms of emissions or pollution, but also in terms of livelihoods, are to be factored in when thinking about profits. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarajali. That was very insightful. Particularly like your remark on how just transition bonds can be used to leverage growth, especially the one that is equalizing. So thank you so much for that. We have with us next Mr. Paul Xavier Espinosa. He's a part of the Risk Management Advisory Services at IFC World Bank. He has extensive experience in risk management, credit, and portfolio analysis with organizations such as the Citigroup, CIMB Philippines. Paul would be presenting a case study on how to operationalize net zero commitments. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, Sanika. So hope you can hear me clearly. So thanks again to the organizers for this opportunity to present to you what IFC has been doing to operationalize net zero. So I only have 5 or 6 slides, which can be flashed. Yes. And I'm happy to take any questions thereafter. So if we just go to the first slide, just to start with a very quick context. Next slide, please. Okay. So as the largest developmental institution in the emerging markets, climate is a strategic priority pillar for IFC and also the World Bank Group. In fact, our target as an organization is an average of 35% of our portfolio or investments into climate by 2025. So within the IFC group, we have a lot of various units which talks about sustainability, and one of which is the Financial Institutions Group, which has already provided significant support to FIs in terms of scaling up climate finance. FIG, or the Financial Institutions Group, works with FIs in the emerging markets either in two ways. One is to help finance projects that support climate change mitigation and also adaptation. And second one is to build technical capacity within FIs in climate-friendly or climate-smart sectors. As emphasized by our colleagues earlier, why do we put so much importance on financial institutions, especially in the context of the country or the global net zero commitments? I think the simple answer is because of the opportunity. So FIs needed to provide majority of the capital to help enable the market to transition to a low carbon economy. And as you can see in the slide, and to top the estimated more than 30 trillion climate smart investment opportunity in the emerging markets. I guess my last point on this slide is based on an IFC study in the emerging markets, FIs must grow the share of climate-friendly projects from an average of 7% in 2016 to 30% by 2030 to help finance the transition to a greener economy. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about our approach to green finance or climate finance, which I briefly touched upon earlier. So IFC, in a commitment to operationalize net zero, works both as an investor and also as an advisor. So on the investment side, as mentioned by Professor Suranjali earlier, there is a need to scale up climate finance in the emerging markets. Hence, on the investment side, we have already invested with over 200 FIs through various climate-related products. And the most familiar one would be issuance of green bonds or sustainability-linked bonds or the newer blue bonds, or even a straightforward climate loan, for example. And all with the aim to increase the portfolio of the FIs to climate-friendly projects. On the other side, on the advisory side, we also work with FIs to build technical capacity in the areas of climate, sustainability, ESG, and also climate risk, with the aim also to equip FIs on how to build a profitable climate business, and at the same time also how to mitigate climate-related risk. Next slide, please. So let me take you a specific case in the Philippines and illustrate how we created a holistic and pragmatic approach to climate finance, and with the aim to support the country in its net zero commitments. So in the Philippines, for example, the new NDC is 75% of GHG emissions reduction by 2030. So this is a rather ambitious target, hence the need for the financial sector to support and to chime in with a contribution. So in the Philippines, you know very well that the country is exposed to physical risk of climate change. FIs with sizable exposures to these vulnerable sectors are also at high risk. In terms of the green or sustainability bonds, we lag behind our ASEAN peers in terms of volume of issuance. But more importantly, there is an opportunity to finance as much as 115 billion by 2030, spread across green sectors such as renewable energy, green buildings, among others. This means that financing solutions for green infrastructure and low carbon transition of the real economy will need to come largely from banks and also the capital markets. So in summary, climate finance needs to be scaled up in the country. At the same time, also climate risk and resilience need to be a priority. Next slide, please. So with the challenges the country is facing towards net zero, IFC is embarking on a huge climate project in the Philippines we call the 30 by 30 zero. So the short name 30 by 30 zero refers to the dual aspirational target to increase the FI climate lending to 30% of their portfolio on average by 2030, while aiming for a reduction of coal exposure to close to zero, and at the same time also mitigating their climate risk. So 30% as percent of total portfolio by 2030 is still a long way to go, right? But this is an aspiration for the country with such huge climate business potential, as well as exposures to climate-related risk. Next slide, please. So this is to illustrate our four-pronged approach in scaling up climate lending in the Philippines and supporting the road to net zero. So we have components at the regulatory level, the capital markets level, the firm level, and also the sector level. So all these components complement each other and provides holistic approach to scaling up climate finance. Let's talk about very quickly the very first component, which is on the regulatory level. So our colleagues from the World Bank are working with the central bank in building capacity on climate risk and supporting the issuance of the climate risk related guidance. As you may know, in the Philippines, the central bank has issued BSP Circular 1085, which is the Sustainability Finance Framework, which gives banks 3 years from the date of issuance to comply with the sustainability principles in the framework, and to embed sustainability and also ESRM in the risk management framework of the banks. So the goal of such working with the central bank is for FIs to be more motivated to address climate risk and a transition to a more sustainable portfolio. The second component, which we also believe as important in terms of scaling up climate finance, is capital markets component. So we believe that the capital market stakeholders need further technical capacity on sustainable instruments. As mentioned earlier, it could be a green bond, it could be a blue bond, or it could be a sustainability-linked bond. And at the same time also be able to manage or report climate-related risks. Hence, working with the capital market sector, we will be able to build awareness and also expertise on the issuers and also the investors. This way, we increase financing to more climate-friendly underlying assets in the country. The third component of the program is to pick one particular sector which has so much business opportunity in the Philippines, and that is we have identified green building. So we are working with various stakeholders in promoting shift to green building. As you may be aware, IFC has an EDGE program, which is a green building certification system, which focuses on making buildings more resource efficient. The last component is on working with FIs. As mentioned earlier, FIs has the right opportunity to bring in the right capital to sustainability in the market. So this is our work with FIs on a one-on-one advisory, and also to build awareness, appreciation, and also technical expertise on climate-friendly projects, and also at the same time so that FIs can mitigate their climate-related risk. Here, with working with FIs, there is a need to approach it at the different layers of the organization, either at the board or senior management, which designs and makes strategic decisions for the bank. Could be at the credit officers or the relationship managers who evaluates or grants loan or facilities, and also at the second layer of defense, such as the compliance with the risk management function. And on the emerging topic of climate risk management, we've also embarked on several initiatives and partnerships in supporting FIs measure their physical risk as well as transition risk. Climate stress testing and also Paris alignment, as mentioned by a colleague from UNEP earlier, are also areas which banks require immediate support. So with this appreciation and understanding, we encourage FIs to grow their portfolio to greener projects. So this is our four-pronged approach in operationalizing net zero commitments by scaling up climate lending in the Philippines. To proceed with the next slide, which is my last slide. So this is just to illustrate sample indicators and also targets to ensure that the developmental impact on our climate projects are visible. And the most notable of which is the GHG emissions avoided. So by scaling up your climate finance, you are able also to minimize your GHG emissions and at the same time also achieve that net zero goal. We also have, of course, an indicator to increase climate lending in climate-friendly projects in the Philippines. So to summarize for IFC, in order to operationalize net zero commitments, our approach is to work with the regulatory side to help them issuing regulatory guidance in terms of sustainability and also climate risk. We also work with the capital markets to make sure that we enable them in terms of the issuance of sustainability instruments. We work with the financial institutions to make sure that they are technically equipped and appreciate sustainability, not just as a compliance point of view, but at the same time also on a business level. And lastly, we work with the sector to make sure that we support the country's NDC. So that ends my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Paul. very pertinent presentation, especially for DFIs. I think there is a question in the Q&A box. Why is target setting done at a portfolio level by banks and not by portfolio companies themselves? So Paul, Remco, any one of you would like to take it, please?
Perhaps I can come in on this one, and others can complement. I guess the way we see it is that the novelty of this whole approach is about shifting portfolios in their entirety. And that's why UNEP, through UNEP FI, ultimately works with the financial sector that has exposures to companies and sectors at portfolio level, to many such companies and sectors on those portfolios. And so I think logically it does make sense for the targets to be set at that level. Now, having said that, portfolios will only shift if there's also a shift at the company level. If there's no shifts at the company level, the portfolio won't shift. So you could say that it's kind of the notion of financial institutions engaging directly with companies individually is a part of the equation, is part of what they need to do. But it would be, I think, impractical and prohibitively cumbersome if financial institutions started setting targets publicly for each one of their clients or portfolio companies, because very often those will be in the thousands, if not 10,000s.
Am I audible now? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much. I think, Paul, there is another question for you in the chat box. What are some of the challenges the IFC has encountered in driving the implementation of its net zero programs in the Philippines?
Sure. Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. So I think not just in the Philippines, but in the emerging markets in general, for banks to talk about sustainability, there are two motivations, right? One is compliance, which is a compliance with our regulator. And then second one is the business point of view. So I guess that's the same challenge we have in the country when we talk about sustainability, right? Because I think for banks in the Philippines, if we talk to them about doing the sustainability instruments, the first question really is, will it bring business scale to the portfolio? And that's something that multilateral organizations such as IFC can come in and also help them explain, or help explain to them what are the business, meaning to say that if you look into the sustainability instruments, that it will also help you grow your portfolio. The other challenge is on the regulatory aspect, right? I think most of the banks here, especially with the issuance of the sustainability finance framework, is they're approaching sustainability just to comply with the regulations. And I think it's a good start, because that will push the bank to really look into this agenda. But at the same time also, I think we need to look more than complying with the regulations. So it has to be approached at both the regulatory level and also at the business level.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. Before we move on, may I request all the panelists to please turn on their videos. My colleagues can take a quick screenshot for this session. That would be nice. Thank you very much. Okay. So thank you so much for all your presentations. We now very quickly dive into an interesting and an interactive climate side chat, which is going to be moderated by Namita. Over to you, Namita.
Thank you very much, Sanika, and thanks a lot, Remco, Suranjali, Paul. I think that was very insightful. and interesting to know the kind of work that's happening all across the world and what can be emulated. So ahead of us, we have an eclectic lineup of experts for a climate side chat on how do we enhance capital flows towards net zero. I think that's one of the biggest questions. And I extend a very warm welcome to all our panelists. So, there is some of my colleagues did set the context or the tone for the session, but I think it's very important to understand where we stand today. The IPCC has clearly indicated the need for global emissions in 2030 to be 45% lower than the 2010 levels and to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. I mean, we know we've heard all of this many a times. What would this mean? This would mean the world must become a net zero carbon emitter by 2050, and to stay under 2 degrees, it has to be net zero by 2070 and 2085. So those are some important milestones for all of us to achieve. Recent events have marked the unfamiliar threat of a pandemic followed by the economic contraction and the Russia-Ukraine conflict that's ongoing, which has negatively impacted the overall global economic growth. And in the midst of all of this, climate risk has once again gone to the top position, if I may say, with 2 days back an extraordinary Antarctic heat wave where 70 degrees above normal not only set a world record, but has upended our understanding about the climate system, right? I mean, the coldest place on Earth surged to an astounding minus 11 degrees on the 18th of March, which put the March readings at close to 38 degrees Celsius warmer than the normal. And this is really unheard of in the history of climatology, and I think warrants urgent action. So to this end, CO2 and GHG emissions need to fall to zero. Significant abatement to GHG across all sectors of the economy is also urgently required. And this realization to achieve net zero did seep into the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions of the countries, the global commitments that we saw many of the financial institutions have made. Remco spoke about the GFANs, where over 130 trillion US dollars in assets announced commitments to net zero. So firms that came to the table, and more than 70 countries have set net zero targets covering about 76% of global emissions. So I think all this is good news. However, it's important to understand that the targets vary in terms of timeframes, scope of GHG emissions, economic sectors that are covered, and this then raises several questions. How net zero targets by different actors relate to each other? What does this say about the shape of the trajectory to get to net zero, as most countries are quiet on the details? How and where will finance come from, given that currently adaptation or transition finance is really minuscule, right? So as we look for answers, I think it is important to remember that the time is very short. Net zero means, these targets would mean little without a concrete plan to cut emissions this decade. So, for instance, if you look at geographies, in all of South Asia, Mumbai, India, I'm proud I sit in that city, is the first and the only city to set up a detailed net zero roadmap. And this is suggestive of the lacuna in planning a carbon-free future, and this needs to be addressed. So all cities, all countries have to have a detailed plan. And approximately 50 trillion US dollars are required by 2050 for net zero. With climate risks pervading every sector and geography, action is required at scale on priority, especially in emerging markets, where we are facing major shortfalls on various fronts, right? So estimates suggest that emerging markets will need an annual investment of at least $1 trillion to achieve net zero by 2050. Southeast Asia alone would require about 2 trillion USD. And this is just for infrastructure investments over the next decade. And then there are country level investment requirements which are touching trillions, right? So South Africa's net zero transition estimates an investment of 2.8 trillion, whereas India needs about 10 trillion USD. So while all these numbers are on the table, the reality is that the current level of investments is a far cry from meeting these demands. Decarbonization investments in emerging markets are only a sixth of what is needed. The case is quite clear. The need to transition is pressing and emerging markets are starved of capital. There is also heavy reliance and expectation from public sources of finance. This puts the onus on DFIs, which are better placed, given that while they operate similarly to commercial banks, they're slightly different. They do have a focus on softer objectives of sustainable development. So it's not just risks and returns, it's also risk, return, and impacts, right? And they have deep pockets. So they're well placed to provide the required capital and also catalyze private capital. Their longer term perspective on project returns match the timelines of net zero projects. And this combined with a time-bound commitment is slated to provide the cyclical effect by linking net zero transitions to developmental parameters like just transition that Suranjali mentioned. So in a sense, DFIs are in a position which allows them to make longer maturity loans at good interest rates, advantageous guarantees, and undertake high-risk equity investments, which is, I think, very much needed at this time when demands to enhance capital flows to net zero is on very high priority. To dive deeper, we have a very interesting panel, very dynamic individuals who are experts and practitioners in their own fields, who will discuss what it takes to pivot towards net zero. Like I said, they're experienced in market regulation, financing responsible businesses, and climate capital and strategy. So from BBVA, we have Anthony Balabrega, the global head of responsible business. BBVA is a large global financial services company that's headquartered in Spain. And Tony, who's also a dear friend, is responsible for sustainable finance, integrating environment and social opportunities and risks, community investments, reputation monitoring and risk management, and integrated reporting and disclosures. He is also currently the co-chair of UNEP-FI's Global Steering Committee and has contributed to the formation of UNEP-FI's Principles for Responsible Banking. So welcome, Tony, to this discussion.
Great to meet, great to be here, Namita. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Next, we have Nicola Mistita, who is the Climate Change Manager for CDC, which is UK's DFI, that has been on the forefront of supporting companies in developing countries for more than 70 years, right? Nicola's work focuses on developing and implementing CDC's climate change strategy. Her experience spans across impact investing and green finance, and she has been instrumental in setting up and managed investment vehicles to mobilize private capital into climate sectors in emerging markets. Also worked with small and medium-sized renewable energy projects in Africa. Welcome, Nicola.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone.
My next panelist is Mohan Vivekanandan, who is the Group Executive DBSA. DBSA, as we know, is one of Africa's leading DFIs, which focuses on very deeply human capacity development, sustainable infrastructure. Mohan leads the Pan-African deal origination and client relationship management. He has worked on developing integrated solutions, bringing together DBSA's product offerings composed of technical assistance, project development, and long-term financing across energy, transport, wash, education, health, municipal sectors. Welcome, Mohan. Glad to have you on the panel.
Yes, thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great. And then we have a very strong representation from the Indian regulator IFSCA. We have Jishan Ali, who is the Deputy General Manager, who is representing the International Financial Services Centers Authority of India. Jishan has 15 years of professional experience in developing and financing sustainable energy, power and climate resilient infrastructure projects in South Asia region. Welcome, Jishan, to the panel. Great. So I am very excited now to jump into the questions. And my first question is to you, Tony. Announcements and press releases have the potential to give an indication that portfolio companies' clients are serious about climate, right? So what is BBVA's strategy to ensure that commitments are followed through, especially in emerging markets where reliance on fossil fuels alongside existing policy barriers pose a significant challenge?
Well, thanks again, and congrats for the organizing this event. Very relevant. Let me share with you first, before going to the emerging countries, how we approach on a strategy level. Well, BBVA is a global bank based in Madrid, but with 82 million customers, so with 110,000 employees. But very relevant for the conversation is that practically 2/3 of our gross income comes from emerging countries. So we have very strong presence in Latin America, Mexico, and South America, and also in Turkey. So that's our positioning as a bank. And when we have placed sustainability and climate change as a strategic priority, this is the only way to move forward. I mean, because we see that this is a huge opportunity. Obviously, it's a risk, this transition, but we see this transition as a huge opportunity for banks in this huge, massive capital allocation that we are going to see. And we want to help our clients and the whole societies to make this transition, and to ensure that we help them to capture this opportunity and mitigate all the risks associated. So we want to provide solutions, financial solutions, advisory service to help our clients to transition. And we have an holistic approach, not only including climate action, but also inclusive growth. Later we'll come back to this. And we have 5 main commitments that I think we summarize our approach. The first is that we have to commit our governance on this. So we have our board of directors who approves and oversight the sustainability strategy and plans. Also, we have created a sustainability area that is reporting directly to the chairman and to the CEO, and with a specific and unique responsibility to mobilize sustainability within the bank. So there's at the highest senior level. The second commitment is obviously we are committed to finance at a larger scale. We announced a few years ago a commitment to mobilize 100 billion euros from 2018 to 2025 in sustainable finance. Last year, we increased this commitment to 200 billion euros. We have already mobilized in the first 4 years 86 billion. So this is the second commitment, governance, mobilization. The third commitment is in line of what Renko says about the commitment on net zero. We were one of the founding members of the Net Zero Banking Alliance and under the GFAN's umbrella. We have already set intermediate targets in sectors covering 60% of the CO2 emissions in power, in auto, cement, and steel. And we plan to set additional targets later this year. We have also included a phase out in coal to 30 developed countries in 2014 worldwide. This is the third commitment. The fourth commitment is the integration of this topic onto our risk processes, obviously. And the last commitment is about transparency. We have already released 3 TCFD reports. And well, thanks to that and to strong commitment on transparency, we are considered by Dow Jones Sustainability Index as the leading bank in the world on the index. But coming back to emerging market, which is absolutely critical, and as you said, it's challenging for us because we have a strong presence there, and we have this asymmetry between developed countries and undeveloped countries. But let's say that we are developing the same strategy, but obviously taking into account the specificities of these economies. Obviously, the starting point is different in terms of infrastructures, energy, landscape, vulnerable populations, and well-being in general. So there is a huge gap there, but also this is an opportunity. We have to say that also renewable projects, have probably low operating costs, but require a lot of capital upfront And in many emerging markets, we see that capital is more expensive. So that's another challenge. Obviously, we see a greater dependency on the natural capital and the higher effects on physical risk. But as I said, we see also this as a huge opportunity. According to the Energy Agency, International Energy Agency, we should multiply by 7 the investment on green finance, moving from 150 billion a year to 1 trillion a year, around 8-9% of GDP year after year on the next 20 years. So to close this investment gap, we are totally convinced that we need strong collaboration with local governments, with DFIs, promoting more blended financing and other solutions in order to incentivize private investment by risk sharing. I think there is a huge potential here by DFIs and cooperation with private institutions. And that's the reason why also we celebrate what GFunds is promoting, because GFunds is promoting chapters in different countries, the emerging countries, to close collaboration with DFIs and governments, not to mobilize capital at the scale with Bloomberg Initiative, CFLI, that was launched in India, and next days will be launched in Colombia, and we are going to co-chair there. So I think it's important. But to conclude, I think it's important that we need emerging countries to succeed, because we are not going to succeed without emerging countries. And I want to make a clear call to action. So we need those $100 billion a year that was promised in the COP. In Copenhagen already, later reinforced again in Paris. That is not delivered yet. We need a strong commitment at the country level. We need clarity about these commitments, how they're going to be funded. We need to scale up and deliver that commitment. And we are quite. We hope that the next COP in Egypt will be a great opportunity to really translate this ambition and commitment into reality, because without this support from developed countries to emerging countries, it is difficult to make the change.
Thank you. I think those were some very important points, and great to know about the kind of commitments that BBVA has made. I think one important point that you made was on partnership, and I see that the launches that you're doing in India and Colombia would surely help mobilize more DFIs and financial institutions to come together to take these commitments, because ultimately we need the entire sector to move in a particular direction, right? So I think that's a very important thing. And yes, of course, we do need that capital that was committed, in Paris as well as in COP. So thanks for those observations, and I'll come back to you, Tony, in a short while. Let me go to Nicola. Nicola, we've seen concrete and decisive steps that are being taken to achieve the net zero within institutions like the CDC, right? And these efforts, operationalized through social, political, and economic systems, are quite pronounced both at the domestic level as well as at the international level. So in light of this, what would be some of the attributes to make net zero a successful framework for climate action within particularly DFIs, financial institutions, but also particularly within DFIs, since that's the larger group present here today? Yes, Nicola.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Namita. So I think there are a couple of points here from a DFI perspective, and given I think what you said in your introduction about the urgency to actually take climate action, particularly in the next 10 years, I think the first point I really wanted to make is that the old distinctions that we had a while ago between development finance institutions and climate finance institutions, I think have really gone, to be honest, because I think the challenge really today as a development finance institution is how can we actually evolve, in the face of a climate emergency, and how we can deliver and invest in order to deliver climate and development goals actually coherently together. So how do we actually support net zero and climate resilient growth that also, supports building prosperity and living standards, particularly in emerging markets? And I think that also brings me to my second point, because if we think about how we can actually invest in order to deliver development and climate objectives together, I think it's really important for DFIs such as CDC and others to really focus on economic transformation. So that really means how can we actually direct, capital at changing how economies work across all sectors. How can we actually support new climate-friendly technologies, and how can we actually embed reduced emissions and increase climate resilience across all the investments that we make across all sectors that I mentioned, given the need to decarbonize all sectors towards net zero. I think the third point, which is particularly relevant for DFIs, is around the need to integrate, the social implications of the transition to net zero. And Suranjali, I think, touched on a lot of this already. And, we worked with her on the just transition roadmaps in India and South Africa from a CDC perspective as well. But I think there are probably two elements here. I guess the first element, obviously, is that a lot of emerging markets, have, historical low, emission levels. So we really need to think about how do we address this kind of climate challenge in that sort of context, and how can we actually invest in a way that breaks, the cycle that links economic growth to growth in emissions, and how we, from a DFI perspective, can actually support new business models and technologies. And then I think to the point around just transition, from a DFI perspective, I think it's really important to think about how do we ensure, that the transition out, so away from fossil fuel dependent sectors, is done in a kind of, just manner. We focus, on reskilling, for example. We focus on quality jobs in low carbon sectors. And how do we also make sure, I guess, that the transition into these new low carbon jobs is really socially inclusive, of workers' rights and gender considerations and broader communities as well. So what I also wanted to outline, just in terms of how that works in practice for us, in terms of how we address net zero in CDC. So the first one is that we made a commitment to net zero at kind of portfolio level by 2050, but also to assess the alignment of individual transactions that we make with countries' pathways to net zero. So at a kind of transaction level, that means we're pursuing more investments that actively support, climate action. So at 30% of our total commitments in the next 5 years will be in climate finance related areas. But crucially, it also means, we're considering the emissions impact of all of our investments, so for the rest of our portfolio as well. And that means we're not taking forward certain investments that we might consider, misaligned with the net zero transition, which is set out in our fossil fuel policy, and that we assess opportunities to provide dedicated finance or advice for emission reductions to our investments as well, so that those companies can pursue low carbon pathways. But we really think, and I think that goes to Remco's presentation earlier, that it's also really important for DFIs to look across their portfolio and see what the climate impact is. And therefore, we're currently in the process as well to set out our kind of short, medium, and long-term net zero transition strategy with interim milestones and targets, and that will really inform all of our investment groups in CDC across all sectors, across all products that we deploy in their origination efforts, but also in their portfolio management as well.
Great. I think, thank you very much. I think those were very interesting inputs, and integrating social implications is something that I picked up, because I think that's very, very important. How do you manage this transition? And there, Jesse, gender equality and social inclusion is particularly a focus for emerging markets, given that women are so much at a disadvantage, right? Also in terms of financial products that are available to them. Great. So thanks, and Nicola, I'll come back to you. I will move on to Mohan now. Mohan, my question to you is that DFIs are at an inflection point. New expectations in terms of greater developmental impact and risk diversification have been set, but this must be accompanied by very strong business model changes, right? So what challenges and opportunities do you see as DFIs are now looking at re-examining their strategies, realigning their business models to meet the new expectations for a carbon neutral, resilient world?
Right. Thanks, Namita. Thanks for the organizers. It's also very nice to be on a panel where the name is pronounced so perfectly. So it's very good to be dialing into the subcontinent. I think I need to do more in Asia and less of these from Europe and North America. So thank you. Again, I'm with the Development Bank of Southern Africa, based in Johannesburg. And just as a quick highlight, the DBSA is a national DFI of South Africa, and our mandate is to promote sustainable infrastructure, both here in South Africa and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So we work with a number of entities, including the CDC, as an example, in the work that we do, and we fund both public and private entities, in funding those projects. I think the key thing to keep in mind is, and again, I'm going to speak from an African perspective, given that's where we operate from, is that, as I think it's well known, and Nicola made the comment, emerging markets and African countries in particular, especially outside of South Africa, have very low levels of greenhouse gas emissions, right? Let's be very explicit. This is not a problem that's been caused by African countries. And, it's always interesting to see DFIs and investors that are trying to tell Africans how we need to solve a problem that is frankly been created elsewhere. And I think that's an important starting point, not because we're blind to where we need to go and where technology is moving, but I think it's because, as we're also seeing now with the war in Europe, as soon as, energy security, as soon as economic are in crisis, the oil and gas industry is getting fired up again. They're even talking about firing up new coal-fired power plants or older ones, right, in these countries. So it's, I guess what it means is, when your security, when your livelihoods is at risk, this, it really focuses the mind on where people, what people really care about. And the reason I'm making this comment is because in an African perspective, we have to take into mind that we need to drive industrialization in the continent. We need to drive job growth. We need to eliminate poverty. And some of the statistics, for the audience here may not be as relevant, of the roughly 1.3 billion people on the continent, less than half of them have access to electricity in the home. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, the energy generation is the same as Spain, where BBVA is from. It's a country of 40 odd million people, right? So there's a massive need to drive this in the continent. Now, the question is, how do we do that in a way that still aligns to the overall commitments, the nationally determined contributions that African countries have made? And we need to keep in mind that the NDCs of African countries are not and should not be the same as the NDCs that, let's say, the Western countries, even China, may have made as an example. But having said that, as a national DFI and as an African DFI, we are very much focused on working towards those commitments that African countries have made, and therefore re-examining our strategy around it. Part of the challenge that we're facing as well is a significant amount of industrial development is still fossil fuel based on the African continent. There's significant reserves of oil and natural gas on the continent, and the countries want to develop them. And as DFIs, the real truth is a lot of DFIs, especially ourselves and on the continent, we're heavily undercapitalized by our governments. Therefore, we have to rely on our own lending activities. And hence, we have to focus on financing projects that are bankable today. Not, for instance, and obviously we will look at things like green hydrogen and those elements, but those are projects that are in pilot stage now and can really only be deployed at scale in many years' time. So it is this balancing act to say, how do you continue to focus on projects that are bankable, that are crucial for the economies of African countries, while at the same time being cognizant of where technology is moving, and you don't want to be stuck with stranded assets either. So and that's a very difficult question because you're looking 10, 15 years ahead and saying, this gas pipeline that we're looking at funding, will it still be utilized down the line? Or are we solving for a 5-year problem, but beyond that time period, there's going to be better solutions? But those solutions don't necessarily exist now. So those are very, very significant challenges. And you're talking about DFIs that frankly do not have much of a balance sheet. I mean, to quote you some numbers, just purely in infrastructure, the African continent needs to spend about $150 billion per annum in infrastructure. Meanwhile, current investment is in the range of about $70 to $80 billion per annum. So meaning there's a gap again of about $70 to $80 billion just in infrastructure. It doesn't talk about all the other elements, right? And as to give you an example, the DBSA, our entire balance sheet is only $7 billion. We only invest about $1 billion per annum. So we are only less than 1% of that. And if you sum up us, all the other African DFIs that are involved, maybe we'll get to about 10, 15% of that amount. So it's a massive gap. We completely understand the need to then shift our models as well to create markets, to create opportunities for private investors to come in. But maybe that's something I can take up in the next question around some of the challenges that we're seeing in creating those markets and the roles that African governments have to play, but also donors and DFIs have to play in creating those market opportunities for private capital to flow into sustainable infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohan. I think, the balancing act between bankability and the new tech, which is maybe cleaner, I think that's one very interesting area that you pointed out. Also the massive gap. Yes, there's so much of opportunity for private investors to come in. However, the whole risk and return model then needs to be really set. So yes, we will come back to you on the challenges and opportunities. And I would now move on to Jishan. Jishan, my question to you is that the aim of IFSCA is to develop a strong global connect and focus on the needs of the local economy. And this is also very useful for a continent like Africa, in fact, and a lead question. These also serve as, international financial platforms for the entire region, right? So against this kind of a backdrop of climate risks, how do you see IFSCA aligning its objectives with the net zero global economy?
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Namita, for having IFSCA in this panel discussion. It's always very interesting to be, part of the panel where you have a lot of participants coming from development finance institution. And although I represent here the Indian regulator IFSCA, before I answer your question, let me just briefly tell you what IFSCA is. So IFSCA basically stands for International Financial Service Centers Authority, which is a unified regulator established by the Government of India to regulate international financial centers in India. Presently, we have a Maryland International Financial Center, which is the GIFT IFSC. We are a unified regulator, which means the powers of the domestic regulators, mainly the RBI or the SEBI or the PFRDA and the IRDA, has been vested to IFSCA, primarily for regulating international financial services centers in India. So we have been given powers as well as responsibilities. And you spoke about, a question which has, a large dimensions associated with it. But let me just straight away go to how IFSCA's, objectives are aligned to climate agenda. You just spoke in your introductory remarks that, the extreme weather events are increasing and we are seeing more and more climate shocks and climate stresses across the globe, irrespective of geographies. And that's why we say, climate knows no boundaries, and that there has to be a global consensus among all stakeholders to address this global concern. And especially countries which are, more vulnerable to climate change, especially in South Asia, we see countries which are close to coastal places are more susceptible to climate shocks, and the cost of these climate disasters are tremendous, both in terms of economic cost as well as the social cost. So it's very important to act now than wait for tomorrow, and that's why we as a regulator, the role of a regulator is very essential to create that type of an ecosystem where you see efforts going on in a fashion that actually produces results. So while we are talking today about net zero, as you are aware that India in the COP26 has committed to become net zero carbon neutral by 2070. And for this to happen, there is huge funding that is needed, and public finance alone will not be sufficient to meet this requirement, whether in terms of enhancing your renewable energy capacities, in terms of addressing the climate mitigation aspect, or whether you want and build on resilience and adaptive capacities of the country. So I personally feel that both has to go hand in hand. You have to address both mitigation as well as adaptation. And there are various estimates. So one of the estimates I was reading through, some time back, was an estimate carried out by one Indian think tank, which said that India may require $10 trillion to move towards transition. Irrespective of the number we agree, whether it is 10, 8, 12, or whatever, but we all agree that the quantum is huge. And in order to meet this funding requirement, as I told you, it's not just the public finance that will be able to meet the funding requirement, and we need private international investors to come and invest in this part of the country. They have to come and invest in emerging economies, in developing markets, such as India. On the other hand, it is also essential that we tap institutional investors, such as the pension fund, the insurance companies, to come and invest in these type of projects. So what we have done, to briefly to say is that we are a nascent new regulator, but our objectives are very clear. As you're aware, Namita, that IFSCA has constituted a high-level expert committee on sustainable finance, which is working to bring in, the recommendation and roadmap to IFSCA as to how IFSCA can come and build a sustainable finance hub in its first merit international financial center, not just for India, but for entire South Asia. To sum up my answer, I think, yes, IFSCA is very much inclined towards the climate agenda, and we want to support mobilization of capital towards meeting these funding requirements in the climate landscape.
Thank you, Jishan. And yes, I must say that both the financial regulators in India, the RBI as well as the IFSCA, are absolutely have put climate on their priority. And through the committees where I'm also involved, we've been working towards how policy and products can be enhanced. So thanks a lot for that. And I will circle back to you very shortly. Let me go to Tony now for the second question. And I'm cognizant that we have 20 minutes left into this discussion. Very interesting. So Tony, my question to you is that banks are very well suited to influence corporate behavior. And there was a question earlier on portfolio versus project level influence, not only in terms of lending, but also in terms of underwriting corporate stock, bond offerings, or managing investment portfolios, right? So as a multinational financial services company, which is operating into so many markets, how do you attempt to get the corporation to behave or to look at aligning with this whole momentum that has been set as far as net zero is concerned when it comes to lending and investments? So, how do you build this overall momentum towards net zero with the corporations or with the borrowers that you are working with?
Yes. Well, net zero, the latest figures, I think, from McKinsey is that we need to mobilize 275 billion. So $275 billion in 30 years. So the 7-8% of GDP, even more in emerging countries. And so we need to help the whole economy to transition. No? So I would say that first, all we are doing is only not, as I said before, not only providing financial services, but also advisory services, try to raise awareness and promote the behavioral change that we need. Obviously at a corporate level, but also at individual level, no? Including also SMEs as well. No? So we need not only to channel sustainable finance and climate finance to green activities or to big projects, and which is absolutely necessary, but we also need to help the whole transition of the economy. All activities must transition, must be replaced in a certain way, as Renko said before. No? So, and I think this is a challenge because we have to focus not only at activity level, but also at the corporate level and help SMEs, help corporates, and also individuals. No? And so the solutions are very different, not only use of proceeds solutions, but also is getting more popular, these KPI-linked loans or KPI-linked bonds, which are products that can be linked to a specific sustainability metrics with certain targets that you agree with your client, and then mobilize that transformation of the client at the corporate level. And we think that this is also very relevant for the transition. No? And then also we have to develop different instruments to invest in activities that are still not there in terms of technological shift. No? And some sector difficult to abate where technologies are not in place to scale. And so we have to obviously not only provide financing, but also equity in some cases, and we have to see how we can share risk with other players, no, to mobilize that at a larger scales in sectors like cement, like shipping, like aviation, like steel, that they need to transform the business model and the operations. No, so and transition finance, I think, is the most relevant one, and we need to engage a lot with our clients in transition. And help to these intensive industries. And that's where the Net Zero Banking Alliance and this framework of Net Zero Banking Alliance is very relevant to help all those clients to transition. I give you an example. For instance, in power, when we need to change energy mix, we have set a target. No, today our clients have an intensity per kilowatt around 250 grams, and we have to achieve 120 grams in 2030. No. And we have to see our clients where they are, what are the transition plans they have, and provide supports to all of them, especially the ones that have plans to decarbonize. No, and we think that even though we could have today a client with a very high intensity emissions, if they have a robust plan to decarbonize and to reduce the gap in this pathway that we need for the net zero scenario, we should provide support them. We should support them. No, and that's the reason why it is very relevant to define these pathways, to have these metrics to help engagement with our clients and work on the transition plans where we can help on the investment to be done on this way. So to conclude, I think it's important to summarize that it's not about how much lending we have in certain sectors or about divesting. It's about investing and what we can help our clients in the transitions and how we can have helping those clients with robust plans to decarbonize their activities in line with the net zero pathways.
Thank you. So absolutely, going way beyond the mandate of financial institutions, or banks, which is just pure banking. I think, hand holding the customer and being able to bring them to the net zero target. I think that's a very, very important point that you made, Tony. Nicola, to you, we've seen that net zero requires a reduction in GHG emissions. However, the changes that are already locked into the climate system by historic emissions mean that there is a need to look at net zero from an adaptation lens as well, right? Which again needs to be, focusing on financing measures. So how has CDC approached integrating adaptation while implementing a strategy for reducing emissions?
Yeah, thank you, Namita. I think that point around lock-in is a very pertinent one, because I think even, if we take all the climate action, necessary to keep temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, I mean, the consequences, of climate change will already have quite far-reaching, consequences, for people and businesses and economies. And that's particularly from a CDC perspective, really important because clearly, the markets that we invest in Africa and South Asia are particularly exposed to these risks, even though, as Mohan said, I think they didn't cause it, in the first place. So therefore, for us, adaptation and resilience is one of the kind of 3 building blocks of our climate strategy, alongside net zero and supporting a just transition, which I talked earlier about. And I think here it's really important to think about some of the kind of economic and financial kind of consequences that we can already see materializing in terms of climate risks. So there have been, some studies that climate vulnerability has already, increased the average cost of debt in a range of emerging markets, both in the public but also on the private sector side as well. And clearly, there's this human cost as well, that people are already exposed, to floods and droughts. And if we think about the chronic changes that are to come down the line, we not only need to think about the physical effects of today, but also how we, plan for those of tomorrow. And that's why, from a CDC perspective, the way we approach adaptation and resilience is basically in two ways. So first, we really want to more systematically assess physical risks in our investment operations. There we focus really, I guess, on those sectors that we see particularly exposed. So that would be food and agriculture, construction, real estate, and infrastructure for us. But then I think crucially, it's not only about risk identification, it's also, working with those companies in those sectors to actually think about how they can actually improve their resilience and really play that role. I think that Anthony outlined more on the transition side as well. How can we actually help them as well to kind of move along in the kind of net zero climate resilient transition. But then the second part of our adaptation and resilience response is also that we want to target more capital at those sorts of businesses that actually offer the solutions for others to become, adaptable and resilient to climate shocks as well. And here, for us, it's really important that we really think about the tools of capital that we have available, and really supporting climate innovation as well. And with the support from our shareholder, the UK government, we recently launched a climate innovation facility, which is really targeted at supporting nascent, innovative business models. And I think a huge part will be actually targeted at businesses that actually offer these adaptation and resilience solutions. And if I can just mention one example that we already invested in is actually Cropin, an Indian-based agri-tech company, and that company uses satellite images and artificial intelligence to actually remotely monitor, for example, crop health, make yield predictions, enable precision agriculture as well. And these sorts of measures can really help farmers to increase their resilience to these climate shocks. So for us, the patient capital that DFIs can provide together, with the advice can really help address some of the market failures that we see in bringing more private investment into adaptation and resilience. And I think this is really a key area where we see, DFIs, private investors, governments can really work together to really breaking down these barriers to accelerate more investment in adaptation and resilience.
Well said. I think the use or the innovative use of patient capital. I think that's a very important aspect of how DFIs need to look at going forward. And one of the points that you made, I see a shift from transition risks to physical risks over the last 2 years. Where DFIs and institutions have started to focus on. So great, thank you, Mohan. My question to you is that getting Africa's financial sector ready to cope with climate risks is very vital for the smooth transition. I mean, the transition that you have been talking about, right? To be able to reduce emissions and become more resilient. So, what could be maybe the 3 focus areas that resonate the most with the needs of the African markets with respect to the net zero emissions, and how can then DFIs make this impact in these focus areas?
Sure. I think going back to the point that I was making, and I think Nicola was speaking about it as well, in the African context, I think there has to be a big focus on the adaptation elements. I think so let me speak on that, and then maybe a couple of the elements on the mitigation as well. Around adaptation, probably 2 of the big areas we're seeing. One is around agriculture, because it's having, and specifically also the availability of water, kind of tied into that. Because agricultural patterns are changing significantly on the continent. We're seeing that happening in South Africa. And also it's also leading to situations where, there's also water scarcity in a number of these countries, and high levels of population growth are also making this a challenge. So adapting to converting agriculture to be more water wise, I think is going to be a critical element. We funded a project as an example around that in Ghana with the Cocoa Board of Ghana. And there's a number of projects around increasing the dam capacity, the amount of water available in South Africa has been a big focus of ours. So that's one element. Another element on the adaptation is around the high level of urbanization that's taking place on the African continent, probably similar to South Asia and Southeast Asia as well, where, driven by obviously the high level of population growth, but also just, high levels of urbanization that have happened in other parts of the world. But the challenge is, that urbanization, the growth of cities is taking place often in an unplanned manner. A lot of the buildings themselves are not really as energy efficient, are not as suitable to the world that we're going to be living in. So that's going to be a big area of focus, I think, for DFIs to help these countries manage the high levels of urbanization. So those are adaptation elements, couple that come to mind. I think on the mitigation side, certainly the energy generation and, switching towards green energy while taking care of base load or peaking requirements until storage or green hydrogen becomes, more economically viable, is a critical element for us now. Certainly something in South Africa, switching from coal towards renewables, but possibly a role for natural gas as well. And then battery storage is something we're working on. And I think that's an absolute need throughout the continent. And then also, down the line, it's not something that I think we've seen much yet, but it's an issue that I think will come to the continent, is the electrification of transport, because that's something that hasn't really started in any real sense that we've seen on the continent. So we're possibly a decade or so behind, Europe, parts of Asia, North America around it. But I think as the continent does get wealthier and you have more motorized vehicles, we need to think about how do we do that in a manner that's sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, resource efficiency, sustainable urbanization, battery storage, or renewable storage, energy storage, electrification of transportation. I think these are the next big investment opportunities, I think, for financial institutions. Jishan, my question to you is, what would be some of the initiatives and collaborative efforts by IFSCA in the areas of policy impact, capacity building, and other emerging areas as, from a climate finance and a green technology lens? I mean, IFSCA has already started to do so much. So can you throw some light on it, please?
Yeah, thank you, Namita, for asking these questions. I'll try to keep it brief and to the point, given the time constraint that we are at this point of time. So we are supposed to close it by 2:30. So IFSCA has taken up multiple initiatives on different fronts, whether it is partnership, whether it is with regard to capacity development, whether it's regard to bringing in some of the best regulations. So let me speak a little bit on the regulatory side, what we have done. So IFSCA, has debt listing, regulation in place, which has a dedicated chapter on listing of ESG debt instruments. There's a provision for regulation for listing of green bonds, social bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, and so on. Some of these regulations have been inspired by the global standards of ICMA and climate bond initiatives. And that is why we have received very positive feedback from various stakeholders in the capital market landscape. Similarly, on the banking side, IFSCA has come up with a sustainable lending framework for the banks operating in this jurisdiction, so which is presently under public consultation process. So this is also a very significant regulation that we have brought in under the banking side, given that banks also play a very important role in the sustainable finance spectrum. On the fund side, we are also coming up with unified investment fund regulation 2022, which also brings in some mandates for the firms to comply with disclosure requirement in line with ISCO's provision. So these are some of the initiatives that we have taken on the policy side. On the partnership side, I'm glad to mention that IFSCA is a member of FC4S. We are also an associate member of ISCO. We are a member of GIFIN. We have signed few overseas, bilateral MOUs with overseas regulators in Europe and in Middle East. So we actively work with various stakeholders, like-minded regulators, UN agencies, international financial institutions, to ensure that we partner and collaborate with some of the best in the business. Similarly, on the capacity development side, we are engaged with various institutions. For example, we work, we are collaborating with some of the important and reputed universities across the globe. We are actually having discussions with various, climate analytics institutions, green fintech type of organizations. So we are actively engaged in the partnership side as well. Overall, the mandate, as you know, Namita, is that we want to, bring in some of the best regulations and create an enabling ecosystem which serves not just the needs of India, but entire South Asia as a whole, given the leadership position in which we are. I think the climate agenda is very important, and the funding needs are huge. And as regulator, IFSCA wants to lead from the front in ensuring that we are able to make an ecosystem where we are able to invite some of the best investors, international investors, to come and invest in this part of the world. So with this, I think I would like to conclude the discussion, but I'm happy to engage with any of you going forward on a bilateral basis. And it was a pleasure talking to all of you.
Thank you very much, Jishan. And I think in the paucity of time, we're not able to go to the third question. But I think very relevant points made by all the participants and the speakers. Your insights, Tony, Nicola, Mohan, Jishan, have been truly valuable. I think it's very important for us to look at how strategically we could bring this whole agenda together and bring in the perspective of the risk return impacts as far as financial institutions are concerned. There's huge amount of capital that's required. Therefore, the huge opportunity that stands in front of us. I think the discussion has been truly very interesting for me, especially from an emerging market perspective. And thank you very much. So over to you, Sanika.
Thank you so much, Namita. We are well approaching the end of the session. Thank you so much for all the 115 participants and all the erudite panelists and the speakers. The conversations have been riveting with a lot of food for thought for all of us. To take the discussion on net zero forward, you may contact the email ID given on your screen or the one that has been put in the chat box. I would like to thank our partners, ADFIM and ADFIAB, for all their support. Thank you so much, and have a lovely rest of the day and weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.